Hello, welcome back to the 19th century and Progress in Poverty, Chapter 4 of the changes that would be wrought in social organization and social life. We are in our book 9, Effects of the Remedy. Yes, Effects of the Remedy. My name is Max and I'm a Georgist. I'm recording these readings because my friend John didn't like the free audiobook of Progress in Poverty, and it is my mission to make John a Georgist. I should be reading that should be my opening right there. You listening, John? And anyone else named John? All right, George writes, we are dealing only with general principles. Yes. There are some matters of detail, such as those arising from the division of revenues between local and general governments, upon which application of these principles would come up. But these it is not necessary here to discuss. When once principles are settled, details will be readily adjusted. I will mention, I don't think I ever mentioned this, after writing these books, he then had a newspaper called The Standard, which was a Georgist newspaper that ran for a while. The Standard. Henry George. Not the most creatively named. Uh, okay, it ran for like 3 years. But it was much more topical to his time. He wrote about the railroads a lot, I believe. And immigration and rum. Uh, his immigration policy, I don't know if I fully agreed with, but his rum essays were very good and railroad essays were very good. But I haven't read them all. All right, back to Progress in Poverty, where we're not going to worry about the details. We're going with the principles, which there is a kind of assumption that being principled is the way one ought to go. Sometimes, I just recently wrote a blog post about sortition, which is this idea of forming legislative bodies at random. And in general, when I'm thinking about electoral reform, voting reform, legislative body formation reform, judicial reform, I mostly do not seek principles. I seek like game theory and incentivization structures, which I don't know, you might want to argue there's a principle somewhere in there. There are plenty of assumptions about the behavior of the different moral agents acting within these systems, but whereas I don't know, when I think about land, there's the two approaches. There is the fundamental morality and justice of every human being getting their fair share of the earth and the idea of sharing being just. And then there is the economic efficiency of disincentivizing speculation, putting land to the highest use. Yeah, so I don't know. Not in all, so I'm just saying, not in all categories do I sort of see the principled approach being necessary, but in the land case, I definitely see that principles are uh, important, relevant. I don't know. Anyway, George writes, nor without too much elaboration is it possible to notice all the changes which would be wrought, or would become possible by a change which would readjust the very foundation of society. But to some main features let me call attention. Noticeable among these is the great simplicity which would become possible in government. To collect taxes, to prevent and punish evasions, to check and countercheck revenues drawn from so many distinct sources, now make up probably 3/4, probably 7/8 of the business of government. That's a crazy claim. You can only imagine that it's even larger now. Well, I guess we have way more government uh, agencies providing way more services to the public. Um, but yeah. Outside of the preservation of order, the maintenance of the military arm, and the administration of justice. Um, okay, so he's saying 3/4 or 7/8 of the business of government outside of order, justice, and military. And it's still very significant. An immense and complicated network of governmental machinery would thus be dispensed with if we were to get rid of all these other taxes and simply do the land tax. Because again, land can't be put into a Swiss bank account. It can't be offshored to the Cayman Islands, wherever the Cayman Islands are. And you don't need to track down the owner. If nobody pays, then the government can just go to the piece of property and put up a sign saying, up for auction. Who wants to move in here and how much land rent are you willing to pay? To the public treasury. In the administration of justice, there would be a like saving of strain. Oh, I will also mention last Saturday, 2 days ago, we had a Los Angeles Georgist meetup with 12 human beings in attendance, most of whom were Georgist, and a few had their Georgist baptism that day. It was very fun. We played the landlord's game. I just wanted to share that with you. But now I'll go back to progress and poverty. Much of the civil business of our courts arises from disputes as to ownership of land. These would cease when the state was virtually edged. I think this will make my typo list. Was virtually edged as the sole owner of land, and uh, all occupiers became practically rent-paying tenants, but of course the rent goes to the public treasury. The growth of morality consequent upon the cessation of want would tend to a like diminution in other civil business of the courts, which could be hastened by the adoption of the common sense proposition of Bentham to abolish all laws for the collection of debts and the enforcement of private contracts. Yeah, this idea that if I loan you money and you don't pay me back, that I can have the government use the force of the sword to go collect that money. For most of my life, I just never thought about that. Yeah, that's the way things are, so that's the way they should be. But sometimes I think that is just a weird service of the government to do. Like you chose to loan your money to this person. Um, the ideas are that you took that risk on yourself. Why should the government have to bail you out, so to speak? The rise of wages, the opening of opportunities for all to make an easy and comfortable living, would at once lessen and would soon eliminate from society the thieves, swindlers, and other classes of criminals who spring from the unequal distribution of wealth. Not everyone would agree that that's where they spring from, but I definitely agree that a significant amount of such behavior springs from the desperation of poverty. Thus, the administration of the criminal law, with all its paraphernalia of policemen, detectives, prisons, and penitentiaries, would, like the administration of the civil law, cease to make such a drain upon the vital force and attention of society. We should get rid not only of many judges, bailiffs, clerks, and prison keepers, but of the great host of lawyers who are now maintained at the expense of producers, and talent now wasted in legal subtleties would be turned to higher pursuits. Yeah, this whole idea that that we spend so much resources, labor, capital on the criminal and judicial system. Uh, I mean, it just does seem like it's just a bog. It's just a it's just quicksand until you solve the root problem of desperate people with no money, and their options are work a subsistence and earn a subsistence amount of living, and then as a class, if they start earning more, they're just going to be have their rent raised, so it's you're just treading water. There's always going to be a large number of people who feel the injustice of that and react. The legislative, judicial, and executive functions of government, and it's like, especially, I don't know, it's so easy to look at people with poor language skills who aren't legally citizens here and be like, well, they should be, it's almost like tacit in my mind. I've caught myself. It's like, oh, they should just be happy that, you know, they're not being rounded up and put to death from whatever third world country they came from, or that they don't have to live under constant fear of just getting killed. They should just be happy to be here flipping burgers, mowing lawns. Um, and there's some sense in which a kind of immigrant or refugee should be grateful because they have gained a relative advantage. Um, but it's crazy to think they're to blame for being born in whatever situation they were born into when we would gain, our society would gain by simply sharing and cooperating with them. I mean, we gain by extorting them. Some of us gain by extorting them. And then you think of the one idea in America is like at least their kids are treated with more respect, but only slightly culturally more respect, I guess. But it's a kind of bullshit respect because they're still, for the most part, trapped at the, you know, underneath George's wedge as wage slaves. George continues, nor can I think. Oh, okay, we're not. Oh. It's a long chapter. Okay. It is the last chapter of this book, but it is a long one. We won't make it through. George continues. Nor can I think that the public debts and the standing armies, which are historically the outgrowth of the change from feudal to alloidial tenures. Oh, what is this alloidial? Land ownership without any, yeah, what? I should know this term. I mean, I've read it in this book before, but I didn't remember it. The system of holding land in absolute ownership, alloidial title. Yes. From feudal to alloidial tenures would long remain after the reversion to the old idea that the land of a country is the common right of the people of the country. The former could readily be paid off by a tax that would not lessen the wages of labor nor check production. The former? Is he talking about feudal tenures? And the latter, the growth of intelligence and independence among the masses, aided perhaps by the progress of invention, which is revolutionizing the military art, must soon cause to disappear. Oh, I guess it's public debts would be paid off by a tax that would not lessen the wages of labor nor check production. And then or this would be VAT, or the first is that legislators would, no, because the first thing he's saying, the former would be by a tax, and that has to make sense. That pairs with the public debts. I guess in the latter is just the standing armies. So we pay off the debts with the land value tax, and then we won't need the standing armies. They would soon disappear as everyone became smart and there were inventions and revolution in the military. And we still have a standing army, but it is, I think, ridiculously inflated than what it needs to be. And it is undeniable that the power of a military seems to be much, much less about the number of laborers in the military and more about the amount of capital that we're able to dedicate to our security from all of our great progress of invention. Society would thus approach the ideal of Jeffersonian democracy, the promised land of Herbert Spencer, the abolition of government, but of government only as a directing and repressive power. It would be at the same time and the same degree become possible for it to realize the dream of socialism. All this simplification and abrogation of the present functions of government would make possible the assumption of certain other functions which are now pressing for recognition. George's quotes about socialism is always funny, where he's like, the socialists, the capitalists all called me a socialist, the socialists kick me out and say I'm just a shill for the landlord or for the capitalists. I don't care I don't know what you want to call me. But the dream and the goals of socialism, of every individual being able to determine their own destiny and being, safe and having money, he supports, or he believes can be achieved through Georgism. Well, through the single land value tax. He was George. Government could take upon itself the transmission of messages by telegraph as well as by mail, of building and operating railroads as well as of opening and maintaining common roads. Yeah, I mean, these things are interesting where it's like, the arguments that George makes, and George is kind of, it's these natural monopolies because they use the land in these certain ways. Yet it sure seems to me that it's like, would be better for the market to handle mail delivery. However, the mail delivery and package delivery, for instance, is dependent on all of the common roads. So I can see a more clear argument for simply the transit and like the right of access being the role of government. However, even with that, sometimes I'm like a little bit, I don't know, the idea of privatized roads is kind of crazy to think about, but in a Georgist world where all of the railroad owners would be paying a full LVT, I really wonder what form that would take. You hear about other transit systems in other countries where all of the sort of windfall gains and wealth generated by being near the railroads is taxed or collected and given back to the community. I don't know too much about this stuff though. With present functions so simplified and reduced, functions such as these could be assumed without danger or strain, and would be under the supervision of public attention, which is now distracted. Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's always this talk about externalities, and that is sort of when you need the government to step in. And that, it's like if the governments are in charge of the roads, then they should also be in charge of, the safety of people when traveling on those roads. Just like if I'm in charge of this piece of land and you come here, I'm liable for your safety on this piece of land. So if you were to privatize roads, then that person who is, has the exclusive use of that land and is choosing to run a business of road usage, it would be sort of incumbent upon them, or I guess liability would fall on them for whenever cars on their roads ran over pedestrians on their roads. There were, yeah, something like that. I don't know. I have to be honest, this is one of the points of theory that I'm not super confident where I fall. There would be a great and increasing. I definitely think that whatever the ills of our society are, I don't think, plumbing and electricity being controlled by the government and the roads being controlled by the government are the biggest sinners. I know that if you read some of I definitely think that there's a lot of influence exerted on government to build certain kinds of transit downstream of single-family homeowners and people wanting to protect their property values and be landlords. And then I also think I forget. Well, I definitely think some of the utilities are there's corruption in how those are intertwined with government slash for-profit companies. And then I definitely think that all of the parking and car-centric infrastructure, well, again, that's like downstream of landlordism, but free parking is this like analog to like throwing out loaves of bread at the Colosseum to make the plebeians think that their rulers were kind and generous. You have all these desperate renters, and then the government's like, okay, well, we'll give some of you guys who have cars all this free extra space. And who cares about the people who don't even own cars? Anyway, all right, let's finish this paragraph. There would be a great and increasing surplus revenue from the taxation of land values, for material progress, which would go on with greatly accelerated rapidity, would tend constantly to increase rent. This revenue arising from the common property could be established to the common benefit, as were the revenues of Sparta. We might not establish public tables, they would be unnecessary, but we could establish public baths, museums, libraries, gardens, lecture rooms, music and dancing, balls, theaters, universities, technical schools, shooting galleries, playgrounds, gymnasiums, etc. Heat, light, and motive power, as well as water, might be conducted through our streets at public expense, our roads be lined with fruits, discoverers and inventors rewarded, scientific investigations supported, and in 1,000 ways the public revenues made to foster efforts for the public benefit. We should reach the ideal of the socialist, but not through government repression. Government would change its character and would become the administration of a great cooperative society. It would become merely the agency by which the common property was administered for the common benefit. I hear of all these public works, and when you're playing a video game, it all seems nice. And maybe after you establish the LVT, there would just be a lot less corruption in government and inefficiencies in government, I guess, but it's hard to see how the I mean, I think a lot of the government inefficiencies don't stem from actually the land monopoly. It stems from just a not acknowledging, as George so often does do, that men seek to fulfill their desires with the least amount of exertion, and the profit motive and the price signaling of the market, which is just humans freely communicating with one another their wants and needs and what they're willing to trade. I don't know. I just see all these things and I just feel like it would be like 10% good, 90%, or 60% done poorly, and 30% somebody would just be pocketing a bunch of money. I think universities and technical schools run by the government have not worked out. I don't know, but I mean, I think some like playgrounds and gyms are better than nothing. Although, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm conflicted about all this stuff. Like libraries did seem great. Nowadays, I'm not so sure if they're just sort of vestigial. I still love some museums, but nobody cares about like nobody does cares about public baths. Like how does this stuff get decided? Who decides it? And then how's it gotten rid of? Like yeah, I don't know. All right, well, with that unsatisfying conclusion, I depart. Bye bye.